Hey, what's up, everybody? It's good to be back on a Friday night. It's been a little bit, schedule's been a little bit crazy, but we're back. The Book of Boba Fett is still about 6 months away from being released. But that doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of rumors and updates, and we're going to talk about those right now.
You're listening to Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Two fans, two generations, all things Star Wars begins now.
All right, hello, everybody. I'm Eric Vansel, and as you can see, Daryl's not with me tonight. But I did not want to go another week without being with you guys and talking some more Star Wars and chatting with you guys, because, after all, that's the best way to spend a Friday night, in my opinion. So we've got a lot to talk about when it comes to the Book of Boba Fett. So for those of you who don't know, the Book of Boba Fett is basically a spin-off series of The Mandalorian, and we were basically reintroduced to Boba Fett in Season 2 of The Mandalorian. Now, he did make a small appearance, meaning just his boot, in Season 1, but it was actually Season 2 that we got to know the character a little bit better. Now, the interesting thing about this is that everybody figured, okay, cool, Boba Fett's going to be this fixture in the world of The Mandalorian or whatever, and when The Mandalorian Season 3 came out, we would just see more Boba Fett and Fennec Shan and some of the other characters that were introduced. But a really interesting thing happened in the season finale. As everybody knows, the big news, of course, was the return of Luke Skywalker in the season finale of The Mandalorian. But if you guys stayed past the end credits, you got treated to a little scene where Boba Fett goes into Jabba's palace and basically kills Bib Fortuna, and he and Fennec Shan pretty much assume the throne at Jabba's palace, and it says, stay tuned for the Book of Boba Fett. So everybody was like, okay, what's this? So at first people thought, well, maybe they were going to turn the Mandalorian into like an anthology series or something. But then that ended up being squashed recently when Lucasfilm basically announced, no, this is going to be a series. And so there have been some updates, and I just wanted to go through some of these updates. You know, of course, feel free to chat in. We're live tonight, and that's one of the things that we love to do. We love to chat with you guys. So, you know, feel free to chat in. But I'm going to go over some of these because one of the things that I find interesting is that even though the show is 6 months away, we're finding out more and more stuff. Now, keep in mind, take a lot of this with a grain of salt because nothing has really been confirmed by Lucasfilm yet. And like I said before, we're still a good 6 months away from the release of this series. Now, the first thing that we learned is that it's probably going to go multiple seasons. There's actually going to be more than just the one season because they were talking about a season 2 of The Mandalorian, or not The Mandalorian, the Book of Boba Fett, whereas before everybody assumed that it was just going to be this limited, you know, maybe 6 or 7, 8 episode, one and done series. But it turns out that that's not the case. We may actually see multiple seasons of this show, which I think is going to hold serious ramifications for the entire Star Wars universe. Another thing that's happened with the time that we were going to bring this whole topic out is that Bossk was rumored to return to the show. Now, Bossk, if you guys don't remember, was the lizard character that you saw in The Empire Strikes Back, in that brief scene where Darth Vader is pretty much addressing all the bounty hunters, and Bossk was the lizard-like bounty hunter that was there. That was a character, honestly, that always appealed to me. I ran right out. I got the action figure. I thought, you know what? This character is really cool. And he seemed kind of mysterious to me. And even though I was always a big fan of Boba Fett, Bossk, for some reason, just held a lot of intrigue and mystery. And so I always wanted to include him when I was playing with my action figures and everything. I always wanted to include him in on anything that I was doing. So he's rumored to come back. Now, Bossk did appear briefly with a young Boba Fett in the Clone Wars series, when Boba Fett was traveling with Aurra Sing and some of the other bounty hunters, Bossk was there. So does it make sense that Bossk is in the Book of Boba Fett? Absolutely. I think actually that it would be weirder if he wasn't in the series. So, we'll have to see how that goes, because we just really don't know whether or not he's going to appear in it or not. I actually hope, like I said, that he does. I think it would make perfect sense. I think it would follow the storyline. It would be perfectly within canon to do it. So hopefully we end up seeing Bossk. Another character, of course, that we expect to see is Fennec Shand. Now, again, that's a character that we saw at the end of the Mandalorian Season 2 finale, where the Book of Boba Fett was actually set up. And she went in, of course, to Jabba's palace with Boba and took out Bib Fortuna. But I think that it's really cool that they're giving her a little bit of a backstory in the new Bad Batch series. So I would expect to see a lot of this new character. She's starting to pop up into the comic books a lot. So I think that, we can see a lot. Now, Joanne Vansel says, does this air at the same time? It's not the Mandalorian, it's the Mandalorian, but I get what you're saying. No. And that's another good point, though. So the Book of Boba Fett is coming out in December of this year. December 2021, we should expect to see this series. Season 3 of The Mandalorian is probably going to come out sometime in 2022. Now, the thing is, we don't really know when that's going to be, because, unfortunately, nobody's really giving us any information on this. There has been some talk that it's going to come out in maybe February or something, pretty much very close to the end of the Book of Boba Fett. However, Pedro Pascal has basically said, look, we haven't even started shooting this thing. He did this really cool interview with Ewan McGregor, which if you haven't seen, it's on YouTube. It's really cool. They basically talk about Star Wars, and of course they talk about acting and other stuff too, but Ewan McGregor starts talking about his experience coming back to the Obi-Wan character, and then Pedro Pascal talks about the Din Djarin character, and it's a really cool insight from both of these guys into their respective characters, and also into working for Lucasfilm, shooting Star Wars, what Star Wars means to them, and so on. But what I find really fascinating is he basically pointed out in this interview that The Mandalorian hasn't even started shooting yet. Now, we know that the Obi-Wan series is shooting now, and so we expect to see that, I think, sometime around the middle of 2022, so it's conceivable that we might not actually see Season 3 of The Mandalorian until around the fall, maybe, of 2022, which seems really far away, but a lot of times people have been referring to the Book of Boba Fett as more like Season 2.5 of The Mandalorian. It's going to basically bridge the gap between the two. So that's what I'm hoping. Of course, another thing that's popped out is that they're going to explore a little bit with Boba Fett where he's been since we had last seen him in The Empire Strikes Back. Now, it's interesting to me that they're going back that far, because I would have assumed maybe they would have gone a little bit into Return of the Jedi, or perhaps how he escaped the Sarlacc pit, which is, I think, something that everybody wants to see. If they're going to do any kind of a flashback at all, they need to do something along those lines. They need to do something where they show how he escapes. And I know that I've said in other shows that we don't necessarily need to see it, but I think it would be a good thing. I think it would be a good idea if we did see how he escaped the Sarlacc pit, because there's been a lot of speculation and a lot of rumor, and I think if Lucasfilm actually did something definitive, it would make a lot more sense. But that's just me. You guys might feel different, and if you do, feel free to leave that in the comments section or chat it live now. So, who are some of these other characters that are popping up in this series? Now, again, these are all rumors, but they're actually from really good sources. So I think that even though you do have to take it with a grain of salt, I think that we can, to a degree, trust a lot of this information because there is good sources that have been talking about it, and it makes sense within the context of what you're seeing in these other series. The first character that's going to be popping up that was mentioned that I think is really interesting is Thrawn. Now, we know that in Season 2 of The Mandalorian, when Ahsoka makes her return, and of course her live-action debut, I might add, that she asks, where's Thrawn? And it's implied that Thrawn, not Moff Gideon, is actually pulling the strings of this whole thing. He's basically the puppet master. And I've said a million times, that makes perfect sense. Because he's the only character that we know of, unless they created somebody new, that would be acceptable to stand in for Palpatine as the big puppet master villain of the saga. At least going forward. And at least until Palpatine returns, as we all know he does, in The Rise of Skywalker. Spoiler alert, in case you haven't seen that movie. But, again, I think it's interesting if Thrawn makes his debut, his live-action debut, in the Book of Boba Fett, because I think a lot of people thought he would make his live-action debut in the Ahsoka series that's coming up. Remember, there's going to be a couple of different series that are all taking place during this era of Star Wars. You had The Mandalorian Season 3, and again, I think The Mandalorian is definitely going to be that series that's going to be the launching point for the next phase of Star Wars. I think that's going to be the flagship series moving forward, and then you're going to see spin-offs of some of these other series coming off of that one. But that said, not only are they just spinning off, but they're all taking place roughly in that same time period. So you have The Mandalorian, you have the Ahsoka series. What else? You got Rangers of the New Republic. You got... There's at least one, well, of course, the Book of Boba Fett. And I think there's one or two other ones that are taking place in roughly the same time period. And they're setting this up. They're setting this up in the new canon in the sense of you have the War of the Bounty Hunters comic series that's out. And there's all the other series like the Star Wars series, the Darth Vader, all these other comics, Dr. Aphra. They're all basically crossing over and creating somewhat of a prequel or a setup for the War of the Bounty Hunter comic series, which deals with Boba Fett, and you're seeing that moving forward into something that is obviously bigger than what you would have expected this whole thing to be. So I think it's really interesting that if Thrawn actually makes his debut, it's going to be in this series. I think that that's bigger than what people would normally think. Because, one, I think that it's interesting that it's crossing the Boba Fett storyline rather than the Din Djarin storyline, which we get, he, of course, being the main protagonist of The Mandalorian. He is the Mandalorian. So, with Boba Fett, though, even though he does have Mandalorian heritage, which, of course, is going a little bit against canon, or at least against previous canon, and I'm not even necessarily sure that's really canon. Honestly, I think that might have been more of the expanded universe stuff, where he wasn't really quite true Mandalorian, but they've legitimized Jango, and now Boba Fett's been legitimized, thanks to what we see in Season 2 of The Mandalorian. But if you really look at Boba Fett, though, he doesn't necessarily seem like he's all that interested in the fight to restore Mandalore. So I don't really see him going with Bo-Katan in this one. I see him maybe trying to establish more of a criminal empire, very much the way that Darth Maul has been doing it. And I think that is where you're going to see this series go. He's obviously taken over Jabba's whole operation now, because once Jabba was killed, Bib Fortuna seemed to be the one who was holding things together. and now Boba Fett and Fennec Shan are going to be holding things together. So it's going to be really interesting to see where everything is going. Ronaldo says, hello. Hey, what's up, Ronaldo? Right now, of course, we're talking about all these things that we're seeing in the Book of Boba Fett. We're talking about Bosk maybe being in it. Now Thrawn's probably in it. Who else? Well, we mentioned Din Djarin, right? The title character of The Mandalorian. It looks like he and Grogu, who we all know as Baby Yoda, may also make their appearance in it. Now, this is another thing that was really interesting to me because at the end of Season 2 of The Mandalorian, what we had assumed was that the Din Djarin storyline was finished. In fact, there were a lot of people that actually thought that what would happen is The Mandalorian would turn into something of an anthology series. So, once Din Djarin got Grogu to Luke Skywalker, that more or less ended his storyline. And now the Book of Boba Fett would pick up, and in essence, they figured it would be The Mandalorian Season 3, but that's not the case. Now we know that it's just something completely different. And in fact, not only is it completely different, but it seems to actually be launching some of the story arcs that we thought were going to be launched in Season 3 of The Mandalorian. So my question to you guys is, what do you think that all means? Because if Din Djarin and Grogu are actually in the Book of Boba Fett, what do you think that actually means for The Mandalorian Season 3? And where do you think the Book of Boba Fett is actually going to fall into the whole canon? Because if they use Thrawn, they use Din, they use Grogu, Bosk is in there, you're going to start to see some things that I think are going to be launched to the point where you could almost say the Book of Boba Fett may become the flagship series over The Mandalorian. And what does this mean for The Mandalorian Season 3? Now, another update, which of course is a rumor, is that Luke Skywalker might even be making an appearance. So now, essentially, what you have is the entire storyline of the last couple of episodes of The Mandalorian being ported over now to the Book of Boba Fett. So, what is up with that? And Ronaldo, of course, basically said it. Well, if Grogu appears, what about Luke? And that's it. Luke is very strongly rumored to appear. And I'm going to say this. If Grogu is in this, then Luke almost has to be in this. Because it would make absolutely no sense for Grogu to be in it and Luke not be in it. But more importantly, my question is, what does this really have to do with Boba Fett's storyline? Where are they taking this character? Because you really, up until now, figured that what was going to happen was Grogu was off training with Luke, and that was going to end that part of the storyline. Now, we do have the whole storyline of somebody, we think it's Thrawn now, but until now we've seen that it was Moff Gideon, who is trying to get Grogu. In other words, the Empire, or what is left of it, is trying to get Grogu for some reason, to harvest its midi-chlorians or something. That was the reason that we had up until now. That was basically what was going on at the end. Because the whole time, since basically Season 1, you pretty much had Grogu being the main target. And I've made a lot of comparisons to the latest series, The Bad Batch, where Omega is more like the Grogu character in the sense of she's the target. She's the one the Empire wants for some reason. She's the one the Kaminoans want for some reason. When you go over to the Mandalorian universe, Grogu's the one that they want. And then you find out through some of the episodes that it's to harvest its Force abilities in some way. And it becomes a little bit, you get a little of the Batman storylines in there in some cases, or some almost like Hugo Strange kind of thing if you're like a DC fan. But I think the main thing, though, that we have to focus on is why would Grogu be an element to the story of the Book of Boba Fett? What connection would Grogu have to Boba Fett? And in what direction are they going to take the character and the storyline that would even connect up with Luke and Grogu? It just doesn't really make sense to me. So a lot of these rumors are really intriguing. And again, we're still 6 months away, and yet all this information is slipping out. And you guys always know what I say. If there's a lot of talk about something, and there's probably some truth to it somewhere in there. And it wouldn't surprise me. Now, of course, Monday, we're going to do a review of the last couple, the episode of The Bad Batch that was released today, along with last week's. We're going to be doing a review of those. But one of the things that I always like to do is I like to compare a lot of the storytelling, because you have Dave Filoni as the common denominator for all of this stuff. He's basically the guy that is pretty much the architect of a lot of the new Star Wars storylines, especially where it relates to The Mandalorian, the Book of Boba Fett, now The Bad Batch. You can see some of the similarities, and if you know where he's going with some of this stuff, because you can obviously see there are connections being made, then you can maybe put some of these clues together and guess where they might be going with it. But it's really difficult to tell, though, because, like I said, in a lot of ways, a lot of the things that we thought up until very recently about the Book of Boba Fett are proving to be either false or at least different than what we thought. I'll go over them like I said. First of all, we thought it was going to be a limited series. Now it looks like it's actually going to be its own longer form running series rather than this one and done kind of thing. We also thought that it was going to be a little bit more of like an addendum to season 2 of The Mandalorian, or maybe a prequel to season 3, kind of like a bridge, like a season 2.5. That's what we thought up until now. And it looks like that's just not the case. Now, Ronaldo's got a couple of points. He says, what if, let's say, on one side, Boba Fett is growing his criminal empire? Okay. All right. I can hang with that. You may have joined after, but I basically was theorizing that as one of the possible things. And in fact, I think that's what everybody is thinking in terms of what this thing was originally going to be about. Thing is, though, obviously, it may be going a little bit askew of that, because number one, if they're bringing Thrawn in, and then, of course, they're bringing Grogu and Luke, it almost looks like it's a continuation of the season 2 of The Mandalorian, where the focus isn't as much on Boba Fett, or maybe it's Boba Fett-centric through his point of view, but it's still dealing with a lot of the storylines that were introduced in The Mandalorian. He goes on to say, and on the other hand, we have Din Djarin, Bo-Katan, and other Mandalorians arguing over who rules Mandalore and Luke and Grogu training. Exactly. And then, of course, Ronaldo says, and maybe Boba becomes a problem for both the Mandalorians and Jedi. Okay. And all the stories collide into one Game of Thrones style. All right, now that I can kind of hang with. I can hang with that. And the reason is because that would make sense. It would make sense if you take some of the stuff that we've been introduced to in The Mandalorian, and then maybe you make it to where you have on one side Bo-Katan and all of her people, Din Djarin and all them, trying to untangle the Mandalore mess. Let's just say that. And then on the other hand, you have Luke training Grogu. But again, it's not like the Empire stopped looking for him. It's just that And that's the other thing, too. Whether this is resolved in Season 3 of The Mandalorian or whether this is resolved in this or what, basically, at some point, it's going to seem like the Empire is going to figure out where Grogu went. I mean, think about it. He's this big target of the Empire. They're sending all kinds of bounty hunters out hunting for him, and they're really sparing no expense trying to get possession of Grogu. It's not like, okay, Luke's going to have him, and then they're just going to go, all right, whatever. I mean, maybe they would if they knew it was Luke, but at the same time, you have to remember, how much did the Empire really know about Luke? The Emperor knew. Obviously, if you remember, as far as the regular Joe Blow Empire Imperial guy was concerned, Luke was just some prisoner that Vader took up, and they never really saw him again. They don't know who this guy is. I mean, now granted, because he is a hero of the rebellion, because he blew up the first Death Star, you do have a lot of these other things that I'm sure were common knowledge about Luke. But they probably just figured he was a really gifted rebel. I don't necessarily believe that they knew that he was this Jedi and all the stuff that was going on between him and these two Sith Lords. Because remember, I don't even think that they knew that Palpatine especially, or Vader, were a Sith Lord. They knew that he was somebody, and they knew he was powerful. But how much they knew in new canon, they did establish a lot of this in the old expanded universe, but once that was thrown out, I mean, where is it now? So you have to remember, from the Imperial point of view, Luke was not this all-powerful Jedi guy that he ended up becoming. So I don't think that because Luke has Grogu that everybody's just going to back off of the search all of a sudden. So we have to figure out where that is. And it's kind of like Ronaldo said, where does this all fit in to Boba Fett? Because remember, this was supposed to be a series that essentially gave us more of an epilogue of what happened to Boba Fett after we see him in The Mandalorian. But also, it's supposed to go back to even as far as The Empire Strikes Back and give us a little bit of where he'd been since then, what he's been doing. And then another character that's coming in is Cobb Vanth. Now remember, he was played by Timothy Olyphant in actually the very first episode of Season 2 of The Mandalorian, which I noted was really interesting because he's actually a character that's from the Aftermath trilogy of books that deals with a little bit of the post-Empire stuff, right? You have Aftermath, Life Debt, and Empire's End. So those were 3 books. I think they were all written by Chuck Wendig. I know that Aftermath was, but I'm pretty sure all 3 of them were. And if I'm wrong, correct me in the comments or chat it in. But it was really interesting that they brought in a character from the novels into this live-action Star Wars series. One of the things that I love that they're doing with Star Wars right now, at least as far as television goes, is they're starting to do some crossover. Some of the people that you meet in these live-action series, right now, of course, all we have is The Mandalorian, but even some of the stuff in the animated series, you are seeing in the comics and in the novels, but more importantly, characters that were introduced in the comics, the novels, some of these other things are actually making their way into the television series. And of course, even within animation versus live action, you have Ahsoka making her first appearance in live action in The Mandalorian. Now, one thing that I've noticed is that there's never really been any rumors that Ahsoka is going to appear in the Book of Boba Fett, which I find really interesting. Of course, she's going to get her own series, but if they're bringing in Luke, if they're bringing in Grogu, if they're bringing in all these other people, especially in the more Jedi-centric storyline here, I'm really kind of surprised that they're not bringing in Ahsoka. But again, I understand that she's not really coming back to the Jedi Order, she's just somebody that, it's just kind of weird. Now, what's really, really cool here, and I'm so happy to see, is that we actually have Daryl with us now. What's going on, Daryl?
Hey, what's going on?
Hey. Wasn't sure if you're going to be able to join us tonight or not.
Yeah, the power, man. This rainstorm like completely like knocked out the power on the block.
Yeah, well, I can imagine. I mean, and that's it. If you guys don't know, here in Michigan, we're just being pummeled with rain. In fact, it's funny that you bring that up because I wasn't even really sure that I was going to even be able to stream this thing tonight.
Yeah, it's been crazy.
But just to catch you up for this last half hour, I've been going on about some of the characters that are appearing in the Book of Boba Fett. I've been talking about Bosk. I've been talking about Thrawn. I've been talking about Luke and Grogu, Fennec Shan. But that we already kind of knew she was going to be in.
Right.
All kinds of stuff. So, Ronaldo says, hey to you. But then Ronaldo also says, I find it hard to believe that Cobb Vanth doesn't appear in the Book of Boba Fett. But he does. As sheriff, he will be interesting in investigating Boba's new criminal empire. Now, that's another good point, too.
Mm-hmm.
Is that if he's actually almost like the protagonist to Boba's antagonist, that would be a really interesting thing to me.
Yeah, I just find it... I don't think he could really handle Boba though, because he couldn't even handle, Din Djarin, man, and Boba's way more deadlier than him, man. I mean,
I know. I mean, it's
so I don't know what he's, maybe he took some night classes or something. I don't know, man, but
well, and here's the thing too that I find really interesting about all of this is that with Cobb Vanth, and again, I wish that it hadn't been so long ago that I had read the novel because I think he's actually a little bit different in the novel, in the Aftermath novel, than he is in what we saw in the opening episode of the series. But I don't know, because you're right. Yeah, I mean, the way he is in that, there's no way.
Yeah, exactly. And what crew does he have, too? That's the other thing, too.
Well, right, because he's basically only the sheriff of that town, which I think was on Tatooine. It was Mos something. I'm sure Ronaldo.
Yeah, but it was outside of Mos Eisley though.
Oh yeah, way outside.
It's way outside of Mos Eisley. So, and depending on Boba where, because do we know exactly where Boba's palace actually is?
Jabba's palace is, I mean, it's obviously on Tatooine.
Yeah, but it's on the outskirts though, if I'm not mistaken.
I mean, it's not. I mean, I think that everybody, because of Episode 4, basically relates everything to Mos Eisley because that's what we know of. But you have all these other areas, though. And I don't remember where Boba's palace was. Thanks for coming on the show and,
come out the gate swinging, man.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much 30 seconds after you come on, it's that's when I forget stuff. Maybe it's you.
Maybe I'm the problem, right?
Well, I don't bring up stuff that I don't remember generally. But I mean, man. I think that's a good point though, because how would Cobb Vanth? I don't understand how he would fit into the show. A couple of the things that Ronaldo says is Mos Pelgo, so he knew he would know. But the thing is, I don't really understand how they're doing this, and just kind of to get you up to speed, some of the stuff that I was talking about, because I want to get your thoughts on this too.
Mm-hmm.
So on one hand, the Book of Boba Fett started out being essentially just this little mini series, maybe 6 episodes or something. Then they announce, oh no, it's going to be its own thing, and it's going to go multiple seasons, at least another one.
Right.
So that's kind of interesting because up until now, we assumed that it was just kind of an epilogue to Season 2 of The Mandalorian, or maybe, at best, a prequel to Season 3.
Well, I've read that they're actually going to a big portion of it, and maybe this is why you're going to have that is because a big portion of that is going to cover like what he's been doing since Empire.
Well,
Is
yeah,
actually going
and
to
I
start.
brought that up. I did bring that up
Mhm.
at the beginning of the show when I was going through a little bit of this is what the Book of Boba Fett's supposed to be. But that's what makes it a mystery to me. Because if you're bringing in Grogu, if you're bringing in Luke, you're bringing in, well, Cobb Vanth could make sense. But if you're bringing those people in, you're bringing in
Mhm.
Din Djarin, you're bringing all these characters in, now it's going away a little bit from what we thought this might be because it's no longer really Boba Fett centric at that point, unless it's like Ronaldo said earlier, maybe Boba becomes a problem for some of these people. So in their individual story arcs, maybe that's how it works. Because the other thing that I brought up too, which I think is what I was talking about before you popped on, is that it's not like the Empire gave up the search. It's not like they're like, oh, well, Grogu's with Luke now, so I guess we can't do that anymore. They still
Mhm.
want him. And if they introduce Thrawn into this whole thing, and he's supposed to be kind of the puppet master behind everything, then obviously that's the case. So it just makes me wonder where they're going with this show. If they're supposed to go back and say, okay, this is what Boba's been doing since Empire. This is how he escaped the Sarlacc. Here's kind of like the backstory to that. Now we're going to show you what he's going to do now that he's sitting on Jabba's throne. Okay, cool. That seemed to
Mhm.
be where it was going. But if you're bringing in all these other characters, Bosk would still make sense. But if you're bringing in Din, you're bringing in Grogu, you're bringing in Luke, now this seems like it's going in a different direction.
Well, I could see this kind of being like almost kind of like a series of reflection type stuff or explanation, like with Fennec Shand being there, almost kind of like and we often liken a lot of the Star Wars storytelling to Cobra Kai. So this
That's
last
true.
past season of Cobra Kai, I love how they interwove Kreese's story into the current situation that was going on, like, and I think that might be a way that they could kind of do that is if you kind of have like, okay, Boba might be reflecting on like, okay, something that might have happened in the past, and so, but it gives us insight as to like, okay, this is what Boba was doing back then, but this is how it's relevant today, and this is why it's so important to him to go off and do this or whatever. You know what I mean? So,
Yeah,
I
like
mean,
it's
that could be
basically adding context to
right,
some of this stuff.
exactly.
Well, and I guess in a way it does make sense that it ties into the greater storyline because that seems to be how they're setting a lot of this stuff up. Because even if
Hmm.
you look at the Bad Batch, the episode that Fennec Shan appeared in, and I believe she appears in the one that is out today as well, it's almost like
Yes.
they're giving some backstory. Like they're going, okay, we introduced Fennec Shan and the Mandalorian, but now we're going to give you some backstory on that character, but through a different show. And it
Hmm.
looks like that what they're doing is they're taking these greater story arcs and they're using multiple shows to fill in different parts of the story. And that seems to be what you're implying they might be doing here.
Yeah, I mean, because they're always like, we're starting to see them now, and I think you heard you kind of covering it. As I was trying to get power to everything. um, I kind of just like, um, was playing it on my phone, and I was kind of like trying to listen in and whatnot, just so I can kind of keep up by the time I could get in here. But, I think that, when you look at, the way storytelling has been being done by Filoni and Favreau, um, we're starting to see, like you said, people coming in, like we see Ahsoka coming into the Mandalorian, and I think we're going to start to see that more. I think we're going to see a lot of the crossover stuff. You're seeing that more in current television anyway. That has stuff to do with that. DC being one of the main ones where they're doing a lot of crossover stuff with the Flash and Batman and Supergirl and all this stuff. So they're having to kind of create this whole continuity platform or whatnot. So I think that's we could be seeing some of that also in Star Wars too, where now we're seeing like how the events of this one particular overarching thing, how it's affecting different people in different sectors of the galaxy. And we've talked about that, as far as like the Bad Batch, like, okay, we're seeing the building of the empire through the eyes of this particular group of people. But then like, well, that's just the Bad Batch. But what about, Ahsoka on the other side of the planet? I mean, on the other side of the, galaxy during the same period of time, but this is what she's experiencing as, but during the same timeline. So, I mean, you could do a lot of different things like that. And I think you're going to have people coming in and out of other people's shows, because then now that kind of makes people want to watch everything because you don't know, and it makes you want to keep up. Because,
Well,
if you know that, say if you know that, okay, well, dang, Ahsoka's popping up and, well, wait, she was just a Mandalorian and now she has her own show, but then she's also in Boba Fett. How? Okay. So now it makes you want to watch all these 3 shows just to keep up with the big story.
Well, that's basically it, right? Because what ends up happening is you're not getting the complete picture unless you watch everything.
Exactly.
So this is one of the things that I think from both a fan perspective and a business perspective, you're actually, it's a good thing. It's not like you're sacrificing anything. What's actually good for the fans is also good for business. It's a win-win for everybody. Mm-hmm. Because this is what I've always wanted them to do in the first place. I really was always hoping that they would start to, instead of keeping everything compartmentalized, that they would start to just put everything kind of in an overarching thing. Because if you think about it, in the Star Wars universe, that's pretty much what it is anyway. It would be different if things are taking place in different time periods. But the most notable part about all this is that it's all being done in the same era. Mm-hmm. So if all this stuff is going on at once, it would be ridiculous that it wasn't crossing over. And it's kind of something that I thought was really funny that somebody pointed out once about the comic books, like the superhero ones. They basically said, if you think about it, virtually every superhero is headquartered in New York.
Right.
By all logic, no crime at all should ever happen in New York. That's got to be like the safest. And not to mention, how are all these superheroes not pretty much running into each other? And that's a good point. Right. And that's almost what was starting to happen with Star Wars. It's like, look, you have all this stuff happening in the same time period. Now, granted, I get it. Just because I'm living in the same time period as somebody from California doesn't mean I know what they're doing, but I know what's going on in California if I watch the news. So It's kind of the same difference to me. But let's get to some more of these chats. Ronaldo says, do you think Omega will appear in any of these series? That's a good question considering who she was revealed to be, which, of course, even though I didn't see the episode today, I know all about it, and we're going to review it Monday. But one of the first things that I thought of was, nobody's really talking about a live-action Omega yet, which you would think so. But
well, I think it depends. It depends. Like I said, we don't know her fate in the Bad Batch either. So,
well, that's true. And there are 16. I looked it up this time. There are 16 episodes of the Bad Batch, and we're only on episode 9. So
9.
We still got a little under half more to go, so we'll have to see. Ronaldo also says, by the way, the Rancor Keeper was also with Cobb Vanth in the novel, along with his Twi'lek partner that he basically was talking about earlier that I didn't put up. So, yeah, I get the fact that there's a lot of Cobb Vanth crossover with this, but at the same time, given the way, and again, this is the difference between the way some of these guys are characterized in the novels versus how they're characterized on television. Now, of course, they could go a completely different route. Just because they introduced him as a little bit of a buffoon, for lack of a better term, in the first episode, he did grow into himself by the end of that episode. Mm-hmm. And I think that they could actually make him closer to the way Cobb Vanth was in the novel now. Especially because you have to remember that he was introduced in the very first episode of the season, and by the end of the season, he had grown a little bit, and of course, some time progressed as the season went on, so and we don't really know, actually. This is another thing. With these rumors, did you clue in on anything about how much time has passed between the end of season 2 and then the Book of Boba Fett?
No, it didn't really say that, but it's pretty much almost
Immediate, maybe?
I would say so, like maybe within like a week or so, maybe even a month, but not too probably far out after that.
Yeah, well, it is interesting to me. First of all, it was kind of a total surprise to even see that ending scene at the end of the season 2 finale.
Yeah.
And then to find that they're basing a whole series on it, that was really
well,
weird.
Yeah. Well, especially because, everybody's been, even back in the day when they first started talking about spinoff movies, Boba Fett was one of the main ones that they always talked about was going to get a spinoff movie. And so everybody's been claiming to see Boba Fett. Then, of course, when The Mandalorian was actually announced, everybody once again thought it was Boba Fett. And it wasn't. So then it was like, so once again, everybody's already kind of been clamoring. So now that you finally see him in The Mandalorian now, you want the Fett now.
Well, and like, that's a good question too. So we all know that we were kind of disappointed when they announced the series The Mandalorian, and everybody thought that was going to be Boba Fett. Because when we found out it was taking place like 6 years or whatever after Return of the Jedi, it's like, oh yeah, they're going to show us episode 1. It's going to be how he escaped the Sarlacc pit and all this stuff and everything else. And that would have made sense. And in fact, when they kept insisting it wasn't him, we kept thinking that they were just covering up or whatever. Because remember, he fought somebody that looked very much like Bosk in one of the trailers. So
yep,
it is interesting. Now, of course, we've all grown to love Din and everything else. But my question is, do you think it would have been better if it had been about Boba Fett?
You mean The Mandalorian?
Yeah. I know, it's a tough one because we see now how good The Mandalorian is, and everybody has become somewhat invested in that character, but...
Well, not only that, but I'm thinking about the main thing of Grogu. Like, I don't think the storyline of Grogu would have been what it was, or... Yeah, I don't know. I don't see the events of the Mandalorian landscape would be completely changed. I think if you did that.
There's no doubt about that. I'm not.
So it's hard to say because it's like we
would almost have to see.
Taking us see what the story would have been with Boba Fett if that's the case.
It probably would have been the Book of Boba Fett. See, I'm actually looking at the Book of Boba Fett. Almost like this is what the Mandalorian would have been if it had been Boba instead of Din.
That's what you said. Well, we're about to get that. I mean, we'll see in December. I mean, we could actually. That's probably a question we can actually kind of start to unravel at least after the first season of But the cool thing is we don't have to because now we still have both. So that's the beautiful part about it.
Well, then that's what I was gonna say because. A lot of times people go, yeah, but we wouldn't have Grogu. We wouldn't have... It's like, look, number one, you didn't even know his name until like episode 5 of season 2, mind you. Secondly, you didn't even know what a Grogu was or a Baby Yoda was until episode 2 of season 1. I mean, it's one of those things that if it had just been straight up about Boba Fett, nobody would have even known what they were missing.
Right.
It's because we got the series that we got that we actually are... all like, oh, okay, cool. Because it's so funny. I was just watching this thing. It's actually kind of Mandalorian related, actually, because it was a little bit of a stand-up with Bill Burr. They'll have all these clips and stuff on YouTube. And I thought it was so hilarious because he was talking about this story about, this gorilla that was doing sign language and all this stuff. And then how he would end up like petting this cat or whatever. They were giving this kitten, which of course they thought he was going to just rip the kitten's head off, but sensed it was a baby, started petting it. And so when they wanted to reward this gorilla for learning, it would let him pet this little kitten. And then Bill Burr goes on to talk about how, the kitten died or whatever. And then everybody's like, oh, basically just almost horrified and sad. And he was like, yeah, I understand. This kitten that you only knew about like for 20 seconds, you're all... And that's kind of how I relate to this, is that everybody is so tied into the storyline now to The Mandalorian because it's so good that it's hard to remember that when we're talking about something like, do we wish that it had been Boba instead of Din? And everybody's like, no, because then the Baby Yoda storyline wouldn't have worked. And I'm like, well, there wouldn't have been a Baby Yoda storyline if it had been Boba, though.
True. That's true.
I mean, everybody's attached. You know what I'm saying? It's like everybody's attached to this, but you're attached to something because you know about it now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think if we would have got Boba Fett out the gate, everybody would have been cheering, But I think because it wasn't Boba Fett, like, okay, you really had to make us believe now, because now you're introducing another Mandalorian style character, to us that we don't know now. Mm-hmm. All we've known was Boba Fett as a Mandalorian. We haven't seen any other ones outside of him.
Except for Django.
I mean, Django, that's true. But
one and the same, really.
They're kind of one and the same anyway, right? Exactly, and it's like his father. So like, okay, we can accept that, but we're just talking about someone completely out of that,
mm-hmm.
out of that realm. So it's like, all right. And then of course you start seeing, we start seeing the Mandalorians in the Clone Wars. So we're like, okay, well, that's animation, and this kind of telling the whole Mandalorian war story. So we're like, okay, cool, we get that, but outside of that, we still haven't seen anything like real, yet. And then now, of course, we're in the Mandalorian series, and now we're getting Bo-Katan, and some of her followers or whatnot. So now I think, it's open, this whole Mandalorian thing all the way open now. But
it's kind of creating depth.
And I think out the gate, we all would have wanted Boba Fett, because he's one of the most mysterious characters, of them all. You knew nothing about him.
Well, and that's why I think that this whole Book of Boba Fett series is going to be so well received, because even the little bit that we got in The Mandalorian Season 2, it's giving you more character development. Because if you really stop and think about it, I mean, if you total all of Boba Fett's screen time in the original trilogy, it's like 7 minutes or something.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't really do anything except stare menacingly, say a couple of lines, and then have a slapstick comedy death. And yet he's this really super beloved character for some reason. So now we actually get a little bit of exploration into his character and why he's so feared and why he's so respected and considered the best.
Now, even though they touched on him in... Wait, pause. That sounded weird. Even though they've, shown us more about Boba, like in the Clone Wars series, now we see him. We saw a little bit of him in Attack of the Clones. We saw him now kind of explored a little bit further in the Clone Wars animation show, when he was like basically trying to hunt down Mace Windu. Do you think that George Lucas is going to have more of a hand in the Boba Fett story, or is it still going to rely on Filoni and Favreau?
Well, I think it's going to rely mostly on Filoni and Favreau, but I think it's pretty obvious that Lucas has had a little bit of a hand in even the Mandalorian story. He was on set a lot. He would give them little pointers. They were asking him a little bit about Yoda's species so they can create the Grogu character. It seems like the Mandalorian is where Lucas went beyond just merely making an appearance or visiting to having a little bit more participation. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, well, that might have been Solo. There was something where he actually directed a scene or two, but that might have been Solo. But still, in those contexts, it seems like he's been more of a participant than a spectator. And so I think that moving forward, now that you have the Book of Boba Fett coming out, he probably had a little bit to do with that too. At the very least, I think he was consulting.
Okay. Just as do you think that's actually the throne that Jabba sat in?
I don't know.
Because that looks a little small.
Well, the other thing is, I don't remember it having arms.
Or a back. I mean, because where was his tail? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I know. Well, here's the thing.
I can see Bib Fortuna kind of putting something.
Right, but if you remember, basically, he just was sitting on a slab.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what probably happened is Bib came in and put this throne in.
Right.
Because he wasn't going to sit on a slab.
Right.
And who knows what nasty juices are on that thing.
Exactly.
I mean, you'd have to hose that thing down.
That thing, yeah.
But...
And how do you bury Jabba? Like, who got the crane and get him out of there?
Well, remember, though, he was killed on the barge.
Yeah,
he was on a sailing barge. He wasn't on his actual.
And they did
throne.
blow up the barge. Yeah, that's right. They did blow up the barge. Right.
Yeah, they blew it up. So.
Right.
He was pretty much incinerated. Okay, Ronaldo says, well, we could say that we have seen other Mandalorians before, but none interested us as much as Boba Fett. And I think that's partially because he was the first one.
Mm-hmm.
He's the one that made us go, well, who are these guys? Oh, he's a Mandalorian. Well, what's that?
Yeah.
And I think that he became somewhat of the template. He very much was to the franchise what Jango was to the story. He was the one that was more or less the seed. So when they were trying to identify the Mandalorians, that's what they did. Because he was never even really identified as a Mandalorian. That's the reason why in the expanded universe, his name was like Jaster Reel or something, and he basically stole the armor or whatever. They said he was wearing Mandalorian armor, but they never identified him as a Mandalorian. And in fact, he wasn't even legitimized as one along with Jango until the Mandalorian series. So I find that interesting. So Ronaldo goes on to say, George is more like an advisor, I think. And that's exactly it. I think that Lucas's role is more advisory than anything with actual substance. I think a lot of this is still coming from the minds of Filoni and Favreau. It's just when they get stuck or when maybe George comes in with a cool idea or they have something that they're going to do where they're going to mess with something that was more him and uniquely him. They probably run it by him to say, hey, what would you think if this would happen or that would happen? Those are the kinds of vibes I get from those guys. But it should be noted, too, that they're really the only ones that were welcoming him mostly with open arms. And as you pointed out a while ago, there's also that it's going to be different because Filoni worked under Lucas.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like Lucas is visiting a set with some director or something like that. He's actually visiting his old
protege.
Yeah, his old protege.
His Padawan, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. And basically seeing the progress. And I think that that's really important. And I think that it's also especially important that this series, and again, this could become the new flagship series if all this stuff is true. I mean, if you're going to pile all these characters and you're going to start actually dealing with all this stuff, I don't know. Ronaldo also says it would be funny if there was a dialogue in the series in which Boba looked down where the Rancor was and said, Moochie. Hey, you know what? If Lucas is allowed to make another special edition of Return of the Jedi, we might get that. I mean, I think that was kind of funny, too, that, they gave the big Rancor a name. But again, this is one of the things that they do a lot now, is that they're trying to take things that are familiar, and instead of doing what the sequel trilogy did, where they rehash them and try to remake or reboot them, what they're actually doing in the context of things like The Mandalorian, The Bad Batch, anything that Filoni is involved in, is they go back and they just add more context to it. So now we know a little bit more. So when you watch Return of the Jedi now, and the big nasty Rancor comes out, you're going to be like, that's Mooch. You know, I mean, you're going to, it means something different now. And I think that that's one of the things that just strengthens the series a little bit more, is the fact that there's depth and richness being added to things that were already there, rather than retreading the same tired storylines. But then again, we'll have to see. But the important thing is, what do you guys think? And that is, do you guys think that the Book of Boba Fett is going to be as successful as The Mandalorian? What do you think of all these characters being in it? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we brought up here tonight about all these characters. You got Thrawn, you got Bossk, you got Luke, you got Grogu, you got Din. Of course, we know that Fennec Shan's going to be in it. That's a given. She was actually created for The Mandalorian. It makes sense that she's with Boba, but there's all these other characters that are being brought in it that, quite frankly, change the nature of the show. So my question to you guys that we want you to leave in the comments is, where do you think this series is going to go, and where does it fit into this current era of Star Wars? Will it overtake The Mandalorian as a new flagship? We want to hear from you guys. And while you're at it, don't forget to hit that subscribe and that like button, because after all, you want to know when we're going to be coming out with new content, like Monday, when we review episodes 8 and 9 of The Bad Batch.
Yep.
Now, before we close out, do we have any Clear Your Minds?
We do.
We do?
We do, my friend.
All right. It's time to clear your mind. All right. So what do we got?
All right. The first question comes from Maddie McCullen. And Maddie asks, will Moff Gideon appear? Do you think Moff Gideon will appear in The Bad Batch?
That's a good question, only because of some of the other Mandalorian characters that we see popping up. But I actually don't think so. I think it's a little bit too early. Now, they might do a little bit of a Tarkin-esque thing, like what they did at the end of episode 3 or something. But even that was a little bit closer. It's hard to say, because they could talk about Moff Gideon as when he was just, you know, Captain Gideon or something. But I think that there's a fine line between giving us depth and context to some of these characters and then shoehorning them in. And I think that, I don't know about you, but I think that if they try to put Moff Gideon in there, unless it was an organic part of the storyline, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think once again, they kind of show that, you know, he's old enough, of course, definitely to have been there. And, you know, him being kind of like, you know, in the ranks, so to speak, you know, in the building of everything, he seems to be kind of roughly around Tarkin's time, but just younger. So I could, you know, it would be cool.
Well,
Definitely.
I could see them doing it from the standpoint of what made him so obsessed with the Darksaber. What made him so obsessed with Grogu? And even though we know that's coming from above, but he's obviously not your typical Moff. He's not your typical, he knows a little bit beyond some of this stuff.
Well, that's why I feel like he's connected to Thrawn so much, because, you know, Thrawn is a history buff, basically.
Yeah.
He's like a history major. So, and it seems like Gideon kind of has studied under his tutelage in that manner. And
he carries himself somewhat like that too.
Exactly. He kind of has that kind of regalness too that
Mm-hmm.
Thrawn, even the way he talks, it's just assume I know everything. It's just like, all right. So I could see it. Like I said, I could see him being in that time period. What I think I mean, I think we will see him? No, they may make mention of him or something like that. Like maybe over a comm or something like that, or
Well, I definitely think that they should do something. Maybe not in the Bad Batch, but they should probably put him somewhere, give us some sort of backstory on him. Not in a book or anything like that either. I mean, something that would come before The Mandalorian. They could even, I mean, why not? They got everybody else in the Book of Boba Fett. They might as well throw him in there too.
Well, that's funny because that leads me to my next.
All right, who's next?
Next comes from Nate Burson, and he asks, with all with Boba Fett taking over the throne and being a part of the criminal empire, do you think that the greatest of them all, greatest bounty hunter of them all, Cad Bane, will challenge him for that seat?
No, because I don't necessarily think that Cad Bane really wants that. That doesn't really seem to be what he's after. Because if you think about it, if Cad Bane were going to do that, he probably would have done it a long time ago, especially in Boba's absence. This is why it's going to be really interesting to see where Boba was between The Empire Strikes Back, then Return of the Jedi, then of course he gets into the Sarlacc pit. Obviously he somehow gets out, and now we get to where I really want to see. I mean, granted, I'm enjoying the War of the Bounty Hunter comic, but I don't necessarily have to see his adventures of trying to get Solo's body to Jabba. I mean, it's cool, but beyond a comic, I don't necessarily need to explore that. What I would like to explore is show us how he got out of the Sarlacc pit and show us what he's been doing since then. And then that would be where I think Cad Bane would fit. But I don't necessarily think that Bane was necessarily after Jabba's throne. Because if you just look at the nature of the way he does stuff, I don't know. It just doesn't seem like that's his thing.
Well, I guess maybe, as I guess Boba kind of, I guess it depends on what he's trying to assert himself as.
Yeah.
We don't know that exactly just yet. And so it's kind of presumptuous to say that that's what Boba's even doing.
That's
this
true
could
too.
just
We
be,
don't really know what
this
he's
could just
doing.
be his base of operations. Now, like, all right, I need a base of operations. Jabba's dead. Cool. I'm just taking this over, and this is my new spot now.
That's true. He might not be trying to take over that or establish a new criminal empire or anything like that. I mean, it could be something else. On one hand, I think that Star Wars, just when I think it's getting a little bit too small, if I just give it a little bit of time, it shows me how much depth it is. I'll give you an example. When Darth Maul came back, okay, fine, I accepted all that. It was far-fetched, but I'm like, okay, whatever. But then when he ended up kind of hooking up with like the Night Watch or whatever and took over Mandalore, I'm like, okay, the storyline's cool, but does it have to be Maul? Do we have to keep making this universe that small? But of course, that was the catalyst for Crimson Dawn and then all this other stuff, and you're like, oh, well, this is actually kind of cool. And so it's taking characters and giving them a little bit more to do, giving them a little bit more depth, not just a single purpose and then, okay, like in the case of Darth Maul, it's like you're not just Palpatine's apprentice before Vader and you've served your purpose and now you die. It's more like, no, there's an actual arc to this character. And I think that they could do the same thing with Boba Fett. They could show us, look, there's more to this guy. I mean, we've already seen that in The Mandalorian Season 2. There's more to this guy than somebody who just stares menacingly and is pretty much the typical bounty hunter. There's more going on there. And I think that maybe we can explore that. But as far as Cad Bane goes, I could see him maybe eventually popping up I don't know if it'll be in the Book of Boba Fett season 1. And again, I don't even think we know how many episodes there are going to be.
No.
Now,
I'm not sure about that either.
Ronaldo has an interesting question. He says, are you going to talk about Leslie Headland's statements about the Acolyte series? Seems like it has some fans worried. What he's talking about is, it's like a live clear your mind. But he's talking about, and it's funny that you bring this up, Ronaldo, because we very nearly made that the main topic for tonight. The only reason why we didn't was because we've been trying to do this Book of Boba Fett update show for like 2 weeks or something. And I felt like it was important enough to the franchise that we should talk about it. And as you guys know, on Mondays, we generally review something. So Friday is kind of like our free-for-all discussion about stuff. And that's why we have this segment. Because not only do we pick 2 questions from people who submit them, but if anybody's chatting, it's your time to ask whatever. And we might actually go more in depth about this next week, but I actually think that the Acolyte series is more intriguing now and is going a little bit more in the direction of what I wanted some Star Wars stuff to go, and that is genre-based Star Wars stuff.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit of a Dr. Aphra kind of vibe. And the fact that, I could say this, the fact that Leslie Headland is so much a Star Wars fan, and she reads like every little book and every little novel, and she's kind of like a Star Wars geek like the rest of us. I think it's cool that somebody like that is finally making something.
Yeah, definitely.
And I find it intriguing. So maybe, I mean, unless something else really, really major pops up for next Friday, I would say that's probably going to be our topic.
We can explore that a little bit more.
Yeah, we can explore that a little bit more because it's true. There is a lot there. Like I said, there was a lot that I was going, man, you know, this is kind of big. Maybe we should talk about it. But on the other hand, the Book of Boba Fett thing is big. And like I've been saying through this whole show, it's so big that the Book of Boba Fett could actually become the new flagship show. I mean, here we're thinking it's like this little bridge between season 2 and 3 of The Mandalorian, but it looks like it's going to be bigger than this. And they've known for a while that it was going to be that. Filoni basically was saying in a recent interview, hey, look, guys, we kind of knew we were going to do more with this, but we didn't want to announce it because Kathleen Kennedy announced all this other stuff. We really didn't want to give that away, which I also think is a little interesting because now you're getting that starting to pop up again. The whole, Kathleen Kennedy's out and Favreau or Filoni or one of those guys is going to run Lucasfilm now.
Yeah, I think that it's going to be interesting. And, you know, the Book of Boba Fett could very well take over The Mandalorian just simply because of the character of Boba Fett itself. Like, people are more in love with that character anyway. Not to say that you don't love Din, but especially if you got, you know, Grogu and Luke, and like these are the people that, you know, folks really want to see. If you got more of that, I could see people kind of, unless you really do something big in Mandalorian that's going to keep them there, people could start migrating over to Book of Boba Fett and really want to kind of, like you said, it becomes a new flagship show.
Yeah, we'll have to see. But whatever the case, let us know in the comments. Again, make sure that you hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the notification bell, hit everything but the dislike button. That's basically the only one we want you guys to stay away from, because we want you guys to be notified when we come out with some new stuff. And speaking of which, Monday night, 8 o'clock, we'll be here to review the latest episodes of The Bad Batch. We missed last Monday, so we're going to review both 8 and 9. And then it's looking like next Friday, we're going to talk about the Acolyte series and Leslie Headland and all the crazy things that she mentioned in this one article and what that could mean for the series. So until then, I'm Eric Vansel.
And I'm Daryl Sanders.
May the Force be with you.
Always.
Head to Head, a Star Wars podcast. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at HeadToHeadSW. Submit your questions for our next show. Visit our official website at headtoheadswpodcast.com. Until next time, may the Force be with you, always.